Hi Year 12s, this is going to be our second video for our PowerPoint on cellular energy, Unit 2.2 of your textbook. In this video we're going to be talking about how we synthesize and decompose ATP in order to obtain energy and use energy in our cells. We're also going to talk about anabolic and catabolic reactions. Now, anabolic and catabolic reactions were mentioned quite a lot in the last video. So we mentioned that photosynthesis was an anabolic reaction, and we said that aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration were catabolic reactions, and I said we'd discuss them later on in another video. That will be this video. Remembering, if you need to know what concepts we're covering in this PowerPoint, that was in the last video and now need to know, so there's no need to know for this video. It's all in the last video as well. Let's start having a look, starting with anabolic reactions. So anabolic reactions are reactions where small molecules are used to build up larger, more complex molecules, and to do that we need to use energy. So energy is required for these reactions to take place. Now, what I've also included on this slide is a table showing some common anabolic reactions that happen inside of our bodies. So for example, DNA replication. DNA replication is when we make up a DNA molecule from DNA nucleotides. Transcription. We're making up messenger RNA from RNA nucleotides. Translation. We're making a polypeptide from an amino acid. And in photosynthesis, we're creating glucose or starch from carbon dioxide and water. In all of these cases, we're building a large, complex molecule from a smaller, simpler molecule, but we need energy to build up that large molecule, and that energy is being stored in the bonds of the large molecule. Catabolic reactions. Now, catabolic reactions is what I use to remember which one is anabolic and which one is catabolic, because catabolic makes me think of cats. Now, I've put a picture of my cat over here, and my cat likes to break things. And catabolic reactions are reactions where a large, complex molecule is broken down into a smaller, simple molecule. And because of that, because we're breaking the bonds in the large molecule, energy is released. So for me, I think of my cat, for example, breaking down toilet paper. When it breaks down that toilet paper, it's breaking this large, complex roll of toilet paper into a small, simple sheet, and he's using energy to do so. He's releasing that energy from the toilet paper. Again, I've included a table with some different types of catabolic reactions that occur in our bodies. So, for example, we have oxidation, which is hydrogen peroxide being broken down into oxygen and water. We have aerobic respiration, breaking down glucose into carbon dioxide and water. We have anaerobic respiration, which breaks down glucose into lactate or ethanol and carbon dioxide. And finally, we have hydrolysis, which is breaking down proteins or polysaccharides or lipids into amino acids, monosaccharides, or glycerols and fatty acids, depending on what you're breaking down. ATP. So we've talked about ATP a lot in this video, in the last video as well. So it's probably important that we know what ATP is. ATP is the source of energy in anabolic and catabolic reactions. So truthfully, that energy is recycled. When we have a catabolic reaction take place and it releases the energy from the bonds of a large molecule, that energy is stored as ATP and later on used to build up a large molecule again in an anabolic reaction. ATP is just made up of an adenine, which is a base, ribose, which is a sugar, and 3 phosphate groups. So technically, that means ATP can be considered a nucleotide. ATP is a very small molecule, and consequently that also means that it can dissolve in water. So it's soluble in water. What about storing ATP? Well, there's two different types of... Talking about cats destroying things. There's two types of reactions that we need to know for ATP. There's the synthesis of ATP and there's the decomposition of ATP. The synthesis of ATP is ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphate group plus energy gives us adenosine triphosphate. The decomposition reaction is adenosine triphosphate breaks down into adenosine diphosphate, a phosphate group plus energy. So truthfully, the secret with ADP and ATP is that a majority of the energy is stored in that last phosphate group. So we've got 3 phosphate groups. Between phosphate group 2 and 3 is a lot of energy. so we can use a lot of energy to store it on there and attach it to ADP, or we can break that bond, releasing all the energy that was used to store it up. It's estimated that humans take up and use their entire body mass just in ATP every day, just to fuel the processes that they require for life. So Mrs. Gren. ATP synthesis occurs mostly during important cellular processes, so we're talking about processes like photosynthesis, respiration, and fermentation. So hydrolysis is a reaction where large molecules are broken down into smaller molecules in the presence of water. So the decomposition reaction should actually be ATP in the presence of water gives us ADP and P and energy. Again, I've included a table here with just an example of how ATP is used in a whole lot of the life processes, so Mrs. Gren. I'm not going to read through that table in this video. Feel free to pause it and write them down. So, aerobic respiration, so breaking down glucose to create energy in the presence of oxygen, gives us around 36 to 38 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose broken down. Whereas alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation, both forms of anaerobic respiration, give us 2 molecules of ATP compared to 1 molecule of glucose. So we've got a difference there of around 34 to 36 more molecules of ATP being generated when you break down glucose in the presence of oxygen. Versus output. So as well as energy, our cells need other type of materials, so raw materials, to help fuel their metabolism. They also need to get rid of waste materials from the metabolism reactions. If we don't get rid of those waste materials, they accumulate in the cell or the organism, and they can poison that cell or organism. So whenever we're taking in those raw materials and energy into a cell, we call that the cell input. Whenever we're getting rid of our waste materials from a cell, we call that the cell output. The types of input and output in autotrophs and heterotrophs is different based on whether they're an autotroph or heterotroph. So again, I've got a table here talking about some of those differences. So outlining just a few of them. So for example, aerobic respiration, that's an input reaction. In autotrophs, we're inputting glucose and oxygen. And in heterotrophs, we're getting vitamins, glucose, and oxygen. And lastly, for perspiration, which is one that just happens in animals, so we can't have that occurring in a plant. It's an output reaction. We have sodium ions and chloride ions being the output, the waste that we're removing.